Welcome everyone. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Have a nice turnout today. I think we have about 24 people who are supposed to be on the Zoom call today, and should be some good information dispensed. So. If you're just jumping on the call, I'm CBC Executive Director Pat Frew. We will be starting momentarily with our panelists today, providing a checklist for getting back to work. So just hang tight. We'll give some of our stragglers here a few minutes to on the call. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin. We have a lot of great information to share with you this afternoon. Again, welcome. My name is Pat Frew. I'm the Executive Director of the Covington Business Council. And this webinar today is about preparing a checklist and the things you need to do mentally as you prepare to return people to your offices. Before I introduce the first of our two panelists today, I want to remind you that a week from today at noon, we will be having our CBC virtual luncheon. Our guest speaker will be Dr. Connie White. She is the #2 ranking doctor in the state of Kentucky. She works for the Kentucky Department of Health, and she's going to be talking about things like what employers can do, getting ready to re-enter the workplace, give us some updates on what's going on with the disease and spikes and ebbs and flows as often happens. And she'll talk about some of the different industries impacted by this. So you'll want to sign up for that again, because it's a virtual event. It's free to CBC members and non-members alike. So please sign up for that today. Without further delay, I wanted to introduce Charlie Vance from Erigo Employer Solutions, who's going to be kicking us off and laying out the plan for giving you the information today. I want to thank both our speakers today in advance. I know they'll do a great job. So Charlie, if you would take it away, thank you.
All right, thank you, Pat. Can you hear me okay? All right. I want to thank the CBC for allowing us the opportunity to do this. Certainly, we've seen a lot of regulations come down the pike, and we see the need for this type of presentation for sure. Both Rob and I have had this discussion. I want to kick us off by just introducing Rob Hudson, who's going to start us off. Rob is a member and attorney at Frost Brown Todd. He is a complete and total expert in all things employment law. He is my friend, and I look up to him quite a bit and think of him dearly, and also he's a wonderful human. And whenever he talks, I listen. He's going to talk first, and I'll just kind of talk about what topics we're going to hear today. Rob's going to talk about Kentucky's Healthy at Work rules, also known as potentially Governor Andy Beshear's executive orders that he's been having these 5 o'clock press conferences and releasing a lot of these rules and discussing these. That's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Those involve face mask, PPE requirements, sanitation, employee screening, communication and training, notice requirements, all of the things that are involved in that Kentucky Healthy at Work rules. We're also going to talk about differences between industries, industry-specific rules that are coming out of the state. Then we're going to flip it over to me. I'm going to talk about a reopening guide, kind of checklist, go over our recommendations, best practices for employee engagement in crisis times, and then also a new rule that's been released by OSHA that may affect some of you. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Rob Hudson.
Thanks, Charlie. And thanks to the CBC for this opportunity to cover some of the basics of returning to work. And let's just begin with a brief discussion of, the goals of a return to work plan. It's our means of restarting and saving the businesses. What a difficult environment, because we're under pressure to save our businesses. At the same time, we have a new regulatory environment, which is daunting, to say the least. So if you were operating, and a lot of you already know this, if you were operating as an essential business or critical infrastructure business prior to the time these new rules came into effect, the new rules really changed your operation, how it is that you would interact with your employees and the rules that they had to follow. And so at that time, it felt a little bit like we were going backwards, not forward, which was very odd feeling. So in other words, you had these essential businesses who were operating without a lot of guidance and rules. There were the CDC ideas, but not a lot from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so when Kentucky came out with their rules, all at once we had many, many pages of new rules to deal with. And that's part of what we'll be talking about today. Of course, the goal is to prevent the spread of the virus. I'm a business lawyer, so I'm always, or usually at least, focused on the bottom line of how the business is going to efficiently operate. But I get that in this environment, preventing the spread of the virus is of perhaps even more significance. So next slide. We wanted, of course, to remain operational. That's one of the goals of the return to work plan. Without any sort of a plan, without any compliance with Healthy at Work guidelines, I mean, we're just going to get shut down by Kentucky OSHA. And in fact, we know of several businesses in the Commonwealth of Kentucky who were shut down for a period of time. So this is a very serious, very substantial set of guidelines. The return to work plan, it provides guidance for management, for the workforce, and a lot of it stems from what's in the public domain on the Kentucky website that deals with these issues. But we necessarily take those rules and we would have to and want to adapt them to our particular workforces. A final goal for the return to work plan, and to me as a lawyer, this is most important, but again, I get that there are multiple objectives here. If we don't follow the guidelines, we may have exposure on the tort suit side of things, the personal injury side of things. And arguably the exposure is perhaps not very high, because in order to be liable, typically you would have a third party that would be hurt, would typically go through workers' compensation. But there is an exposure here that we want to try to make sure that we limit. And of course, we have Kentucky OSHA issues to deal with too. As indicated before, some employers have been shut down. So I think the return to work plan, from a lawyer's perspective, we're looking for legal protection. We're looking to limit our exposure by following the rules as best we can. Next. First, we'll go over general rules, and I'll try to be very brief here. we're talking about 6 pages of guidance for the general rules for businesses. That's quite a lot when you're trying to reopen and save your business when you have this new environment, but it is what it is. First rule, continue to telework where possible. So whenever a lot of businesses received the word that Kentucky was reopening, it really wasn't quite that. People weren't allowed to just come on into the office because if they were teleworking and they could continue teleworking, then really they were supposed to continue teleworking for the most part. And you can make arguments that, well, if I'm not able to telework very efficiently, I should be allowed to come into the office. And that's part of the discussions that employers have been having. But really, rule number 1 was stay home if you can stay home. Employees who are able to perform their jobs via telework were to continue to telework. And entities were encouraged to implement a phased return to work. So not everybody all at once, or not every part of the operation would begin. Each business would develop their own approach for phasing. Enforce social distancing, of course. This is the one that we all get at this point, minimum of 6 feet, unless it's impossible to perform duties with that distance. So we'll continue with the general rules. Moving on to the next slide. With masks and social distancing, with the general rules, this was probably one of the most troubling aspects of it. The first was understandable: minimize face-to-face contact with one another, conduct meetings, telephone and internet. But most importantly, businesses, organizations, and entities had to ensure that, to the greatest extent they could, that employees wear the masks, subject to a couple of exceptions. If it creates a serious health or safety hazard, no mask. When working alone in an enclosed space, no mask. Or when working alone in an area with more than 6 feet of social distancing, no mask. But everyone else is supposed to be wearing masks. And you have employees who are older and who struggle with the masks, and younger employees, but a lot of older employees who have health conditions, they struggle. If you're in an environment where it's hot, people are struggling sometimes. So there are a lot of big challenges with the masks, and I've had clients reach out to me and ask, do we really need to do the masks? What if employees won't wear the masks? And my response, and I'm not trying to be flippant about it, is, the governor has ordered this. We know that if we get sued, that the governor's orders are going to be relevant in all likelihood and admissible. If we're not following the guidelines, you have to think that that's a problem for us in litigation. And you also know that it's a problem if Kentucky OSHA visits. So yeah, tough issue with the masks, but that's the rule. And some clients that I work with are following it. Some clients aren't following it. And I get that. I get that. But all I can do as a lawyer is advise as to what the governor's order is. So next. PPE and social distancing. These masks are to be provided, and also gloves at no cost. Entities are supposed to encourage customers to wear masks. So it's not just the employees. Entities have to make gloves available to employees whose duties include touching items or surfaces often touched by others. And there's a broad-based directive from the Kentucky rules: follow the CDC, OSHA, or other applicable federal guidelines. So there was really a lot to get up to speed on as folks were either reopening or continuing to do business under the Healthy at Work guidelines. Next, Charlie. On sanitation, and I think most of you are probably, this is probably pretty comfortable and you're getting used to it now. Supplying sanitizer, something you were doing even before the rules were out. Encouraging hand washing and restricting access to common areas so as not to have a group of people together. I think we all get that. Next. Sanitize frequently touched surfaces, that the business is responsible for that. And when a business has identified someone who has COVID-19 or associated symptoms, the entity has to further ensure that they immediately restrict access to contaminated areas, post signage, and adequately clean impacted areas. So that would be part of a reopen plan. Basically telling people how you're going to handle this sort of issue, someone who has symptoms or someone who has COVID-19. And any contaminated area should be off limits to all but essential personnel for a minimum of 24 hours. So, no, that's fine. We're ready to move on. I think the next item is really challenging for a lot of folks. It started out to just be temperature checks. That was the first thing that sort of came to everyone's mind, temperature check. But it ended up being a lot more than that. And in Kentucky, it's pretty extensive. The daily temperature and health checks. So you have to require employees to undergo daily temperature and health checks. And the checks can be self-administered or administered by the entity prior to workplace entry. The temperature and health checks, again, they can be performed at home, and employees who have a fever or any symptom of COVID would be directed by the employer immediately to their healthcare provider to be tested and then instructed to quarantine at home as soon as any illness is detected. So that's a big item. If someone has a COVID-19 symptom in Kentucky, they're supposed to be sent home and instructed to quarantine. Also, the employer needs to tell the employee, go get tested for COVID-19. And that's a little different than a lot of states, the way they're handling it. I think it's a pretty aggressive and good approach. Let's get someone tested. But the oddity of it is with the symptoms, if you've got a headache, that's a symptom of COVID, but you can have a headache for lots of reasons. And that's pretty difficult to put someone out of work and throw them into potential quarantine or COVID testing when they've just got a headache. And I think that'll be one of the big challenges over the next few months. Next item, Charlie. Communication and training. If an employee tests positive, an employee or the employer needs to immediately notify the health department. That makes sense. And there's this pretty broad-based education and training piece that I think most employers are not, maybe, I want to be fair to employers, but I think this is really a difficult thing for employers at this time. They're trying to stay in business. They're trying to follow all the guidelines. And, the education and training is really not so easy to do in the midst of all this, especially when you have social distancing guidelines that you have to follow. So you can't bring everybody together in the same room, but you're trying to train them. I think that's challenging. Employers have got to be prepared to assist public health officials if there's an employee who tests positive. And that's just cooperating and asking the right questions and providing access and things like that. And within the guidelines, within the Healthy at Work guidelines, it's noted that people can call this hotline to report problems. And a lot of problems have been reported on the hotline, that's for sure. A lot of our clients have received reports and such along those lines. So next, Charlie. Back to the health and temperature checks for a minute and going into just a little more detail on that. We talked about the fact that all businesses have to do this prior to work each day. It has a great goal of minimizing the spread. We all get it. And that it can be done at home by the employee. But there are reporting requirements. I mean, the daily temperature needs to be reported to the employer, and the health checks need to also be reported to the employer. So now we're like in the middle of this thing, and that's kind of a new job that the employer has to make sure that the health and temperature checks are working out okay. And so employees with a fever of 100.4, of course, don't report. And let's move on to the next item, Charlie, which gets a a little more into the detail. And I think this is the third iteration of this particular part of Healthy at Work guidelines. You know, they came out on day one and then they changed and they changed again. So this provides a little more detail about what you need to be asking if you're an employer, so that employees, or what employees need to ask and then report to their employer for the Healthy at Work guidelines. And it basically includes listing the CDC recognized COVID-19 symptoms, have the employees respond yes or no, whether they have the symptoms. They need to address whether anyone in the household is showing symptoms. And they need to address whether they've had close contact with anybody who's showing symptoms. And so every day people are filling out these forms around the Commonwealth, but of course, some employers just aren't doing any of this. And the employers who aren't doing any, again, it has to be a strike against the employer, I would think, to not have any of this infrastructure set up. Next, Charlie. So if the employee answers no to all the screening questions, they can come to work. If the employee, they have to be instructed. If you have symptoms during the day, then you have to go home. If the employee answers yes to any of the screening questions or has a temperature, then the employee can't work unless they're cleared by a medical professional. The employee needs to self-isolate at home and follow CDC guidelines. So that's again going to be the challenge over the next few months, is that when people have any of these symptoms, and it includes things like muscle, you know, I mean, I get muscle pain a lot. I play some tennis and other sports. I'm older, I get muscle pain. So, you know, I think that that this is a tough part of it, and I think we'll have more and more situations where employees are maybe not being honest, or maybe they're just staying away from work for a while for something that was clearly not COVID. But hopefully they can get a quick test and that they can get a negative test. So moving on, Charlie. Okay, specific additive rules for each sector. I'm just going to hit on a couple of ideas here. That the office rules, 50% rule, masks and stay at home. So that was kind of a challenge on the office piece of it, because you know we can't bring everybody back to the office, and we'd like to do that. The challenge in the manufacturing, distribution, and supply chain area, I think, was the masks. It was really continues to be a big problem. On the retail side, I think, I don't know if it's a big problem yet that we can be at no more than 33% of capacity. There are lots of rules on the retail side of things. I mean, things like what you want a sign that says don't touch things unless you're going to buy them, or try to keep it to a minimum. There are just lots and lots of detailed rules. I wish we had time to talk about all of them. So moving on to the next item, additional plan items. What if an employee tests positive? Well, no return until there's a negative test or they're medically cleared per CDC guidelines, and contact a health professional. So I'm suggesting that within your plans, you want to build in, what do we do if an employee tests positive? And this information is here for you. It's consistent with CDC ideas. So moving on, Charlie. What if an employee has an exposure incident? Well, there are CDC guidelines for that too. And the CDC guidelines have not always been the same. They sometimes change, so you've got to stay updated. What if an employee has symptoms of the virus? Well, arguably, they're treated just the same as if they had had a positive test. So that means that they're going to be out, and they're not going to be returning until they're medically cleared or until certain criteria are met. And maybe you won't have these things in your plan, but just be aware that if you have these situations, symptoms, an exposure incident, or someone who has the virus, then you've got to follow a protocol of some sort to protect yourself from liability. and to stop the spread of the virus. Moving on. Okay, restaurants. I'm not gonna, I'm given the time frame for the webinar, I'm not gonna cover the restaurant rules, but there were lots and lots and lots of rules, many pages for restaurants. And you know, a lot of restaurants are good, great local restaurants are smallish in nature, and you know, it's the American dream of serving people, helping people, doing something you love. And the restaurants are really, I think, challenged. There are a lot of rules. It goes on for many slides in this presentation. And I'd encourage any of you who are in that industry to go ahead and you're going to receive the PowerPoint. So take a look at this, take a look at what's online, and do the very best that you can to comply. But I have to say, as a professional in this area, if it were me trying to run my business and also comply with these guidelines, man, that would be a very difficult environment, especially when the rules do tend to change. And you can see Charlie's running through all the slides there for restaurants, and it's kind of boggles the mind, right? So all the general rules apply and all the restaurant specific rules apply, and that's the environment in which we're all operating. You know, it was just a couple of months ago that we as lawyers, we were helping our clients to grow and to hire more people and to open more locations. And man, as professionals, we went from doing that to being COVID lawyers. And so it has been a change, but I have been very grateful to have things to do, to have ways to help clients during this time. And I really appreciate, again, all the efforts of the CBC. And I want to thank Charlie for asking me to help out today with the presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Charlie at this point, and he's going to bring us home, or at least bring us to the time when we're going to entertain some questions. So thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, Rob. A daunting amount of rules, as you can see, that Rob laid out there. I'll ask again. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Rob?
Very well.
Okay. You know, Pat had asked, you know, can we put together a checklist? And, you know, Rob went over some state rules, all of the Kentucky state rules. He went over some CDC rules. And what I would say is, you know, I toyed with, and I have some template return to work guides that kind of have everything laid out for you. And Rob and I debated, you know, the value of that. And what we decided was each business, at least in Kentucky, is going to have to develop their own. They're going to have to work with a professional. This is my opinion. And people can disagree with me. But I think that you need to work with an attorney like Rob or someone who's competent in this space to build your return to work guide. Make sure it's accurate for your industry, specific for your particular business. The number of employees that you have is relevant. The space that you have is relevant. There's a lot of factors. And I think being in Kentucky, we're also very different than other states. And so some of these templates that you might get from SHRM or your industry association, they may not fully comply with Kentucky state rules. So I would encourage folks to reach out to your attorneys and folks that you trust who have knowledge in this area. What I did here was I just put together a brief outline, and this is my opinion about things that ought to be included in your guide. If you're going to put together, okay, here's how we're going to go back to work. It needs to include what we're going to do to modify the workplace to get back, disinfecting and cleaning, employee screening protocols. That's the asking questions, the taking the temperatures. What do we do in the case of an exposure? What do we do in the case of a confirmed illness? What do we do in the case of an employee that has symptoms? And those might be different. And also we're going to have some, as Rob mentioned, some training to do. and maybe some materials to create there for social distancing, use of masks, personal hygiene, and that's washing hands basically, cleaning, and anything that's industry and business specific. And then you might want to take a look, at least at a temporary review and revision of some of your workplace policies. And I'll go over some of those policies that you might consider revising. All right. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was, okay, we've been out of the office. We've upset, our businesses. We've moved employees out of their comfort zones and told them to work from home. And they've been doing that for a couple months. And that's been difficult, I think, no question. It's been stressful on folks. And now we're talking about, okay, now that you're used to working from home, we want to bring you back to the office. And I just want to talk about how those changes, changing of itself, is stressful for employees. And as employers, we've got a lot on our plates. We have a lot to think about. And in my opinion, one of the foremost things to be concerned about is making sure our employees stay engaged, that we keep our retention up, and we do everything we can to keep them safe. So I just wanted to address the stressors, the uncertainty in the economy, the uncertainty in job security. That is a major stressor. Fear of health concerns. We've got employees. You may have an employee who is at high risk, or maybe they have a family member at home who's high risk. And that can be stressful if they're concerned about exposure. So we want to make sure that we are communicating appropriately what we're doing to keep them safe. We're cleaning, we're wearing masks, we're sending people home that are sick, we're doing all the things that we can. People have been in isolation in some cases. They've been at home by themselves, or they've been away from their family, their loved ones, their friends. That can be difficult. Maybe people have lost someone. I know 2 people who have passed away from this illness. And, people have died from this. A lot of people have been insulated from that. I think our numbers in Kentucky are really low, but it has happened. Not to mention the recent news and civil unrest, which has been deeply troubling for me, and I think it has a lot of people. But this is just to say, this has been a stressful time, and I think employers need to be aware of that, and we'll talk about some ways to address it. And just to reiterate that fact, Express Scripts is a local pharmacy benefit management firm. They released a study. They said that anti-anxiety medications rose between February and March 2020 by 34%. So new prescription, that's overall prescriptions. They also said that percent of all of the prescriptions, more than 3/4 of the prescriptions for the week of March 15th, 2020, 78% were antidepressants. And 78% of the antidepressants were new prescriptions. Now, I'm a person who watches these numbers. I watch our health plan. Jumps like that are mind-boggling. They're very, very unusual. And I say that just to say we're in unusual times and people are stressed. I've linked the source to that article here. And when you receive the PowerPoint, you can check that article out yourself. All right. Ways that employees can cope with stress. I would encourage, and I encourage our clients, and I would encourage other employers to encourage your employees, take breaks from the news. Take a break from social media. Put your phone down for a minute and try and relax. Maybe take some time off. Make sure they're taking care of their body, taking care of their mental health. Eat healthy and well-balanced meals. I mean, for me, that is something that makes a huge difference in my own mental health and how I'm feeling. Make sure that they're getting exercise and plenty of sleep. I'm not saying that as an employer you need to police this. I'm just saying you should encourage employees to do these things. Sending articles about the benefits of these types of things, I think that is important. These are all of these things came from the CDC. This isn't a Charlie's subjective opinion thing. Avoid alcohol and drugs. You know, the first thing that I thought of is someone who walks between human resources and employment law. The first thing that I thought of when we went out for a long period of time where we would be isolated was there's going to be mental health issues, particularly in the areas of addiction. And I am concerned that we've sent some employees home who had a healthy drinking alcohol manner and are going to come back with an unhealthy one. And I just think we need to be cognizant of that as employers. That may be in our, depending on how many employees we have, that may be in our mix. And particularly for large employers, you may be likely to have something like that. Encourage your employees to connect with others, get outside, get some sunshine. What can you do as employers? I would recommend that you refamiliarize yourself with your health plan and the mental health services that are covered, and then communicate those services, those benefits to employees. It may be a while since you looked at it. It may be a while since the employee looked at it. But make sure that that information is at your fingertips and at their fingertips in case they need it. I'd also recommend connecting employees with a trained mental health practitioner if they need it, if they come to you. A lot of companies, a lot of carriers, a lot of health insurance carriers already have relationships with some of these web-based therapy services. Some of those are Talkspace. I know our carrier, Humana, has a relationship with Talkspace. There's also BetterHelp and Amwell. You can go to those directly if your carrier does not have a relationship already. But developing that resource so that employees can take advantage of it quickly and easily when they need it, I think could be a helpful step in overcoming some of this stress returning to work. There's a stigma with seeking help for mental health issues. I would venture to guess that most high-functioning professional employees have struggled with stress, anxiety, or depression, maybe not in a clinical sense, but in some way. And so, to me, it's important that we generally as a society, but also among your employee population, to reduce the stigma and say it's okay to go seek help, or it's going to be anonymous. If you seek help, your employer is not going to know. Take a look at your EAP plan if you have one. Often those programs include an app that can be helpful to employees. They also often include free financial consultation or a free mental health screening. They also would have lists of mental health care providers in the area. I'd also take a look at your leave plans. Make sure they're flexible. Make sure they work for you. Has anything changed post-COVID that might make you want to rethink what your leave plan is? Provide support generally for employees with children and high-risk employees. I have 2 young kids at home. It's been a struggle for me, I know, without childcare. And so if you've got employees with young kids, they've been watching the kids and trying to work, and that has been difficult. It's going to continue to be difficult. Daycares are reopening Monday, and they're not going to be at full capacity. So not everybody's going to have a spot. So you're going to have employees who are still going to be in that boat, working from home, watching the kids. And let me tell you, it's very stressful. And last but not least, and everybody knows this, I just want to reiterate it because it's important to me. Generally, I think be kind. Just be kind to employees. Treat employees as humans, not expense lines. And that could be one of the best ways to avoid a lawsuit. And that's not something that people need to hear, but it's nice to be reminded of. All right, communication is key in this. Bringing employees back, as I said, could be stressful for them. but honest and open communication is what's going to help combat that. I say honest and open, and what I mean by that is you don't want to tell your employees everything's going to be fine, no layoffs are coming, and then in a couple weeks you have to lay a couple people off. And what does that do to morale, and what does that do to the trust there? So I always encourage clients, be as honest as you can. Of course, you may not be able to share everything, but I would encourage you to try to be as honest and transparent as you can. Regular emails with employees to let them know what's going on. The worst thing that can happen is that they don't feel connected. They don't feel like they understand what's happening, where they're at with their job, what they could be doing to be better employees. So regular communications, calls, keep those employees engaged. Putting up posters with the guidance. We're going to send some posters out through Christine and Pat that you can use. This is hand wash guidance and face mask guidance. Additionally, communication is a two-way street. Think about soliciting dialogue from your employees, surveys and feedback. Employees that feel that they have a voice are more engaged. That's just fact. Communicate your plan for reopening. Make sure that you communicate all the safety steps that are being taken. Try and reassure employees who may be concerned about contracting illness or spreading it to their loved ones. Clear guidance for employees to follow. So with mask wearing and hand washing, and Rob went over a lot of that. Appropriately prepare the facility to bring back employees, and that's following state and CDC guidelines. This link is a link to the CDC guidelines for cleaning. There's a lot there. I wish that we could go over it together. It's just not feasible for us to do. But here's the link, and it's pretty straightforward about what you need to do. I would also suggest communicating a justification for reopening and bringing back employees to the office. That's a decision that you made. Tell the employees it's time to come back. We believe it's time to come back because our business is going to be better off. We want to keep this business going and want to have the best business possible for employees and for owners, and justify that communication. Also include communications about what happens if the employee gets sick, has symptoms, or gets exposed. What are we doing? If you just have a policy but we don't communicate that to employees, then they're not going to fully understand that if their coworker gets sick, we're sending them home. So let's make sure that we communicate that. I would recommend a central communication source for all of these things. We set up a website on Google, but intranet could work. And I've just listed here some items that I think should go in that central communication source. Among those are new and updated policies that I think should maybe be considered in post-COVID times. Among those are attendance policies, PTO, FMLA, of course, FFCRA, which we're not talking about, which is its own whole deal, which we could have another hour or two presentation on. Company travel should probably be updated, timekeeping, and what happens if we have to close the office in the future? What happens if there's a spike and we got to go back? That's on a lot of people's minds. And then safety guidance, what are we doing with that? To me, it makes sense to put all this in one place so employees can refer back to it. Ensure employees understand. I mean, I think this is a tough part. Rob talked about it. There's some training requirements here. If you're a small business, it may be difficult to train, 3 or 4 employees, and who's going to be the one to do that? Is it going to be the owner, operator? You've got a lot on your plate. But I think it's really important that we make sure that employees understand what we're doing and what these new policies are. It may also be helpful, God forbid, there's a lawsuit in your future. Have employees acknowledge receipt of any training rules or procedures. So that's just, if you're going to have a training, you might as well document that employees were there, have them sign off on it, that they received those trainings, and that may come in handy in the future as well. I wanted to talk about enforcement of these rules, and how difficult I think this is, and how each business is going to have to make their own decision. So I'm talking about, we've got rules about mask wearing, and Rob said, you're going to have employees that might not want to wear a mask. It's uncomfortable. People don't like it. And some people are just downright opposed to it. So you've got to walk that line and be somewhere in between, complete and total laissez-faire and total authoritarian. And I don't have the silver bullet. If somebody does, let me know. But it's somewhere in between. There has to be some enforcement and oversight. But at the same time, you don't want to lose your employees. You don't want them to feel like they're not trusted. So I think there's a balance to walk there, and each business has got to evaluate that and what that means for them. And that's where working with, a talented attorney could come in handy to know what you have to do versus, what is not particularly necessary. Okay. Finally, I'm going to make this part very brief, and we'll see if we have any questions. I just wanted to cover that this is federal OSHA, what I'm about to talk about, not Kentucky State OSHA. Federal OSHA released some guidance recently talking about if there is an exposure, would it be recordable? Now, if you are a OSHA covered entity, you'll be familiar with the OSHA 300 log, but is it recordable? And in what circumstances? And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because it's a reversal, a recent reversal of OSHA's position. So just very quickly, you do not have to worry about this rule. There's been some debate about this, but I think where we've landed is that you do not have to worry about this rule if you're not covered by OSHA. You're not covered if you have fewer than 10 employees, or you're in a certain low hazard industry. So I have a link to a list of low hazard industries, but it's really, office spaces, legal services, accounting, insurance, business support services, that type of thing. Do not have to comply or record incidents for federal OSHA purposes. If you have multiple business establishments, you might want to contact an attorney about that, about whether or not your high hazard location would subject your low hazard location to these reporting requirements. I think the answer is typically no, but it's worth a discussion. An example there would be a construction company that has a construction site and then maybe a back office. So the question would be, does the back office have to report an exposure illness? And the reason that I bring it up is because of this second item right here. Employers have to record if there's a confirmed case and if they determine that the case was exposed in the work environment. And I can't hear anybody on this call, but I can feel that people saying, how in the heck will I know if a COVID-19 case came from the work environment? And that's the big question. That's the big question. There's a lot of guidance there. And I've listed the questions that you need to go through to determine that. And if you determine that it did come from the work environment, and it resulted in days off of work, a death, a hospitalization, then it would be recordable. And so just wanted to make people aware of that. And I'll say again, talk to your attorney about that. I've also linked to OSHA's recommended infectious disease response plan here for your guidance. again, as I said, we have some resources that we sent out to Pat and Christine, and they're going to get those out to you shortly. And I'll see if we have any questions.
Hey, Charlie, I've got a question starting off. It's been very interesting. I've heard, and Rob, you can weigh in on this. I've heard stories about how, young people are reacting to returning to work, as opposed to older professionals. And in many cases, to me, it's a surprise that younger people are more reluctant to come back than maybe some of the older employees. Do you have any kinds of suggestions on, because I don't think I heard either of you talk about the age disparity and how you communicate. You've covered more and done a great job of covering all the rules, but younger employees versus older employees, what kind of advice do you have for people out there and how you communicate to them?
Well, Pat, I'm just smiling because, the part of the challenge that we have in Kentucky is that the governor has essentially said, if you can work from home, you need to work from home. And so the employer doesn't have its typical leverage that it would apply here by saying, we need you to come in. And that's when the conversation really starts. Here's why we need you to come in. Here's why, you need to know that we're going to operate in a safe fashion. We're going to cover we're going to comply with these guidelines. It's important to us. Your safety is important to us, et cetera, et cetera. But in Kentucky, we're not even really supposed to be having those conversations if the person can work at home effectively. And I think for that reason, I agree with you, Pat, and I'm shocked at this, that young people do not want to come back to work. And old people like me, I was chomping at the bit to come back. I really, really wanted to come back. And I could go into all sorts of examples, but I don't have a good answer. I just have thoughts and observations. And for now, the young people will stay home. I mean, they just will, if they're in an office environment like the ones that most of us work in. So, Charlie,
I've got a client who's got a lot of young people, and they don't want to come back, and we want them to come back because they're easier to be monitored in the work site. And so, as Rob said, the current rule is if they can work from home, then they must. So we're holding off on telling them you got to come back. But I'm not sure if I'm a young person or not. But for me, I got very used to being at home, and so the change from going home to going home was an adjustment, and now I'm used to it. And now we got to go back after we've confirmed already that it can be done. Our jobs can be done at home, right? And to young people, I think they think, why? But I think Rob and I are both face-to-face guys. We like to see each other and network. And, maybe that's an older thing. I'm not sure. You're on mute, Pat.
I hit the button, but I guess I didn't hit it right on. Rob, you talked about the fact that employers have less power to make people go back to work. Have you heard of any cases where employers have mandated that you shall return to work? And could they face legal action for that by telling employees that they have to come back?
Yeah, well, not directly, Pat. The way it would work, the legal action, the way it would work is that if I'm violating the Healthy at Work guidelines and it gets reported to the state, then the state will come out, and right now we're not sure exactly what they'll do. I mean, they have to shut businesses down, or they could say, come into compliance immediately, or we're going to shut you down. And that means anyone who can stay at home needs to go home. So that's one way that it could manifest itself in a further action. The other way that the other thing that could happen is if someone gets sick then it's legal action for having violated the Healthy at Work guidelines. And it's a tort case, so it's a negligence case, Pat. And in negligence case, you have to have a standard, the reasonable man or reasonable behavior standard. And in Kentucky, arguably, the Healthy at Work guidelines are that standard. And that's why it's really difficult for employers to just walk away from those things. And you hear people say, well, I don't think the governor really has any power, and I don't think that we should be following these guidelines. Well, yeah, you're entitled to your opinion, but let's see what a judge or a jury does at some future date. And that's why businesses have to make their own decisions about these things, and they're really tough calls.
Yeah.
Charlie, do you have anything to add to that, or did that cover it?
Totally agree with Rob.
Okay, I know we have at least one question, and before we wrap up here at the end, now's the time. Don't be bashful if you have any other questions. So one person, Karen, was saying it feels like it's going to be very difficult and indefensible to reopen. So either one of you want to handle that question?
It's very difficult to reopen, and time will tell whether we're going to have lawsuits arising from violation of these guidelines. And I don't think we have them out there yet in Kentucky. And furthermore, groups like the Kentucky Chamber, with the support of the CBC and the Northern Kentucky Chamber, are going to be advocating in favor of immunity statutes in Kentucky that will hopefully prevent a lot of those lawsuits from having been filed. So you've got a lot of tension there. You've got the need to try to curb the spread of this virus versus the ability of a company to operate in a reasonable fashion. And, where will we land on those immunity statutes? I don't know, Pat, but part of the challenge is in our General Assembly, who are members of the General Assembly? Lawyers. Lawyers aren't real thrilled with immunity statutes. It doesn't help business or circumstances for lawyers. I mean, that's just how some lawyers operate. It's very difficult to get legal reform through the General Assembly. So I don't know where that ball's going to land at all. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very challenging to reopen and stay in business at this time for some businesses.
And I would just add, it looks like that question came from Karen. Karen, I have been out of law school now for 10 years. I've been working in this space for that long. And it has been extremely difficult for me and this is my job. It's what I do, to wrap my head around all of the laws, regulations, compliance issues that we're faced with. So if you are a car mechanic or a dentist, I imagine that it would be very difficult. And you're not alone in that. If you're struggling with that, trying to figure this out and walk this line, you're not alone in that. If that gives you any solace.
Okay, so let me ask one more scenario. I don't see any more questions at this point. I'll ask one more before we close. But say that cases spike and they have to shut down businesses again. How much more difficult is it going to be to reopen once we get to a point where cases plateau or go down? There's been a lot of talk about how damaging to the economy that's going to be, but I imagine it's going to be even more difficult to come up with standards after that. Please comment on that.
Well, the essential businesses, the critical infrastructure businesses are still going to be operating in all likelihood. And I can share with you that just from the perspective of a lawyer and legal work, we did not have a diminution of work because of those critical infrastructure businesses that really had 1,000 questions. So the economy is capable of continuing on even with a limited shutdown. And but the sadness of it is what we all see, which is they're business casualties, they're business deaths. And if we have to shut down the businesses that recently reopened, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be a business here, a business there, and we're gonna lose them, and it's unavoidable. And only time will tell the true impact on our economy overall. You know, we can already see the entertainment and the hospitality industries just being decimated at really all levels. And meanwhile, people who work with manufacturers like me and other professional organizations have found a way to, you know, continue to be engaged. But man, one thing it does, Pat, is you are thankful every day for the opportunity to work. That is one thing that this pandemic, and it's a, you know, I'm looking for any silver lining out there. And one thing is we're all more grateful for what we have, for who we have, and our livelihoods.
And I worry about, in that scenario, I agree with everything Rob said, and I also worry about employee morale there. If we're closing down, opening back up, closing down again, with not much certainty about what's going to happen. Is this the new normal? Is this how it's going to be in the future? You know, keeping employees engaged throughout that and keeping them productive, I think, could be a real challenge for folks, the folks that are still operating, at least. You know,
Gentlemen, go ahead, Rob.
Pat, before you wrap up, you know, part of, you know, you hear the platitudes of we're all in this together, we're going to get through this, et cetera, et cetera. Part of that, and I think it's okay to feel that way, but part of it includes supporting our local businesses, including folks like Charlie. You know, Charlie he has been a leader in the field of human resources and benefits and such in his business space. And I just want to encourage everyone who watches this video, all the current attendees and future viewers of it, to consider Charlie if they have human resource benefit type issues, because he's there for us and he's been terrific with our clients. We appreciate him very much.
Yeah.
thank you, Rob.
Rob, Charlie, any final thoughts as we close here?
I would just say, just reiterate what I said. This is difficult. We're, as Rob said, the platitudes, we're all in this together. Our contact information is available on the slideshow that we presented. Please reach out if we can answer any questions. And we will continue doing this. We'll continue to keep going forward, and let's get this economy started back.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Just in closing, as Charlie said earlier, all the slides will be sent to participants, including the link to listen to this again. And, you know, behind me here, this is kind of the CBC's motto: we are your access to opportunity and growth. So taking part in our programs right now that are virtual, our weekly text group every Wednesday morning. And I mentioned earlier the luncheon coming up a week from today. So thank you all for your time and your attention. That concludes the program. Thank you, gentlemen. Great job.
Thank you.
Bye all.